I sat in my office and looked out the window, thinking about what a pile of shit my life had become. The winter wind was blowing outside, and the weather forecast was calling for heavy snowfall. Of course, that made most of the townspeople happy, since Christmas was still almost 3 weeks away. However, some families were not so happy. It was all about the fact that the unemployment rate in the county was now over 14%. This meant that many people were out of work. I picked up a sign from my desk and looked at it. It read, Tom Ambrose, President. I thought back to the day I bought the radio station, with a slight sadness but with great pride. You see, I own the only radio station in the city and county, WJTW, 1590 AM. As I sat in my office and watched the wind whip up snow swirls, my mood fluctuated between somber and hopeful. Even the Christmas music blasting from the speakers in my office did not fill me with holiday cheer as it usually does. These were desperate times for me, as I was in danger of bankruptcy. But I had a plan that would hopefully get me out of trouble. It all started almost 18 months ago when Windward Sporting Apparel Company announced that it was winding down all of its U.S. operations. Only 2 factories remained, one in New Jersey and one near Milton, North Carolina, my hometown. Our local factory was the 5th largest employer in the area. There were many rumors about closing the factory, but in the end, the decision was made to cease all operations. The factory closed in just 2 weeks, leaving nearly 200 people out of work. That was 200 direct jobs. The neighborhood probably lost another 300 or 400 indirect jobs due to the factory closure. This was followed by the announcement that the local Walmart store would close its doors after a superstore opened 20 miles away. Then, several other businesses closed or relocated, including CVS Pharmacy. Then the national economy plummeted. Unemployment in our area was between 14 and 15% and threatened to get higher. As the economy in our area collapsed, the radio station lost about 40% of its advertisers, and now I was struggling to pay my bills. I had mortgage debts for the station and for the land I had purchased for the new tower. Moreover, I had just learned that Edgar Brenner, the mortgage holder on the land, was insisting on foreclosing on it. My debt was only $37,000, but if I couldn't get the mortgage in order, I would lose the land and all the money I had invested in it. It seemed all I did was juggle bills and keep the wolves from the door. Owning my own radio station was a lifelong dream. I had always been fascinated by all forms of broadcasting, but I especially loved radio. But because of all my recent troubles, my confidence was severely shaken. Nevertheless, my love of radio remained. I was taught in my business classes that if you keep losing money, you have to cut your losses. But I didn't want to give up the station. My love affair with radio began when I was in 2nd grade. That's when I first noticed the tube radio my mom always kept on in the kitchen. It had a nice, soft, warm sound. In the morning, Mom would tune it to her favorite station, WNEW in New York City, and William B. Williams would fill the room with friendly conversation and quiet music. On cold winter days, I would look at the radio and envy Mr. Williams. He was in a warm, safe place, while I had to soon be out in the cold to go to school. Of course, I had no idea at the time that Mr. Williams probably had to get up at 4 in the morning and trudge through New York City traffic in the freezing cold to get to that warm, safe place. In any case, I believe that's when I fell in love with radio. My love of radio grew over the years, and by the time I got to high school, it had become almost an obsession. And yes, I was the guy who did the morning announcements. I was as close to radio as I could get at that time. And yes, I was also one of those weirdos who helped with the audio and visual aids for the school. Shortly after school started, I found a job. It was part-time during the school year and full-time during the summer. I put a huge portion of the money I earned into a savings account that I called my radio station fund. I continued to work in college and save money. I had good enough grades to get a state-funded scholarship, and my parents paid the rest while I pursued a business degree. I wanted to major in communications, but I also knew that a business degree wouldn't hurt when I finally owned my own radio station. As soon as my parents left me in my dorm room my freshman year, I set out to find a college radio station. By the end of my first hour in college, I was already signed up to volunteer. The next 4 years were just great, and in my senior year I was promoted to radio station manager. And even more wonderful, it was a paying job. I received $500 a month for managing the station. The only downside was that I had to socialize with Chad Duncan III. Chad was an insufferable snob. Unfortunately, he was also the editor of the school newspaper. Chad's parents were quite wealthy and owned a number of newspapers and magazines in the Northeast. And he told everyone who he was, how much money his parents had, and that someday he would run TriStar Media. Like I said, he was an insufferable snob. Nevertheless, I had to chat with him at all the school events to plan appropriate advertising on campus. I also had to chat with him at the quarterly budget meetings that the school insisted on for all organizations that received money from the college. I started attending these meetings when I was a sophomore, and really got involved my junior year when it was decided that I would be the next station manager. During his junior year, Chad became editor of the school newspaper, which only inflated his ego even more. We first ran into each other when I presented my budget at the beginning of my senior year. The station desperately needed to replace a bunch of old equipment. I swear Marconi must have built some of our equipment, so old it was. Chad also wanted to increase the budget to purchase a new computer system, even though the current computers were less than 3 years old. He also wanted to purchase new furniture for the newspaper offices. When the budgets were finally approved, the radio station received a $40,000 increase, and the newspaper's budget was reduced by $25,000. Needless to say, Chad was furious. The newspaper's budget was cut because it went digital a few years ago. It used to be that the biggest expense was printing. But these days, they were printing a lot less than actual newspapers. Most students read the paper through an app on their phones. It didn't matter to Chad. He now hated the radio station, and especially me, since I was the station manager. Since I had met Chad, I knew he had a girlfriend named Amanda Edwards. She wasn't stunning, but she was very nice. Anyway, they had been together since the beginning of freshman year, but then Chad suddenly dumped her in the middle of senior year. This really upset Amanda, who, in addition to majoring in interior design, was one of the columnists for the school newspaper. Amanda went to work at the radio station, which further embittered Chad against the radio station and me. I gave Amanda a job as a roving reporter and assigned her to run a weekly editorial column. Even though Chad turned her down, he was outraged that I had taken her on at the radio station, so Chad's anger spilled out onto the school newspaper. He started criticizing the radio station in every issue. We at the radio station, of course, fired back. Then Chad complained to the college president that we were wasting our budget on pizza and beer. Even though we were having weekly pizza and beer parties at the radio station, we were paying for it out of our own pockets. Still, I had to go before the disciplinary board. Chad showed up with pictures of some of our parties. I showed up with receipts showing where every penny spent from the station's budget went. Obviously, we had done nothing wrong, and no disciplinary action was taken against the station or me. Nevertheless, I thought the whole feud was silly and tried to bury the hatchet. Chad saw this as weakness and stepped up his attacks. It took a few weeks, but we got our revenge, or we thought we did, with the help of computer science student Billy Williams. Each week, when the article was ready for publication, Chad would review it one last time. He would then digitally transfer the finished product to the print shop and post it online. Billy figured out a way to intercept the finished article and substitute it for the one we wrote. We didn't do anything horrible, just inserted ridiculous stories, dozens of limericks, and only half of each sports score. We put in a few silly editorials demanding nap time in every class. We also posted one article demanding that the drinking fountains dispense beer instead of water. When the paper came out, Chad was furious. Most of his staff thought it was very funny, which pissed him off even more. I couldn't understand why he was so upset. By all accounts, it was the best issue of the paper in years. We wanted to embarrass Chad, but things turned against us. However, Chad didn't see it that way. "You son of a bitch!" yelled Chad, storming into my office and throwing a copy of the paper on my desk. "You did this! You ruined the paper!" Chad was so angry, drool was flying from his mouth. "I don't know how you did it, but you did it. I won't forget it." Finishing his tirade, Chad hopped out of the radio station and I grinned, putting the incident out of my mind. One of the good things about our prank was that the paper had stopped printing nasty articles about us. I thought he had finally calmed down and put the incident behind him. But the truth was that the administration had already come down hard on Chad. They thought he was abusing his position at the paper. And Chad was the kind of person who doesn't forgive and never forgets. Shortly after the fake paper was released, Amanda and I started dating. At first, it was just casual dating, but as time went on, things got more serious. At first, I only thought of Amanda as a volunteer. Then we became friends and finally started dating. After we developed a close relationship, we moved in together and lived in the same apartment for the last 3 months of school. By then, I was completely in love with her, and I thought she felt the same way about me. Anyway, 6 months after graduation, Amanda and I got married. Amanda got a job as an interior designer for a large company. At the same time, I got a job as a stockbroker for a large financial organization. We were both making decent money, but we hated our jobs. Amanda hated the woman she worked for, and I hated selling the financial instruments our company created. I considered them flawed investments. Nevertheless, things went on for a year until one day Amanda came home and informed me that she was quitting her job. She had decided that she wanted to start her own interior design company. I was a little upset that Amanda had not seen fit to discuss this with me first. However, I wanted to support my wife in her new endeavor, so I left it at that. I should have realized that this was the first red flag about my marriage. With only one steady income, I was paying most of the bills. Since we were married, every time I received an award, I divided it between the foundation of our new house and the foundation of my radio station. 80% went to the new house fund and 20% went to the radio station fund. And if Amanda received cash for her work, she would transfer that money to the new house account. However, after Amanda quit her job without discussing it, I changed the way the bonuses were distributed. It would now be 50-50. Amanda was not happy about this change and no longer contributed a dime to the new house fund. This was red flag number 2, and I completely overlooked it. About a year after that, the bosses at my job decided that I was doing a very good job, so they offered me a new office in Greenville, North Carolina. I thought Amanda would hit the ceiling when I broached the subject. But to my surprise, she was thrilled. Because Amanda was facing larger interior design companies in our current office, her business wasn't growing as fast as she wanted. The thought of moving to a smaller city intrigued her. The move went smoothly, and Amanda's business did grow. However, she still wasn't making as much money as she was making working for a large interior design company. On the other hand, I got a bonus for moving to Greenville. I also got a bonus for opening an office and staffing it in less than a month. And finally, I got a bonus for making the office profitable within the first 6 months of operation. Still, I hated the job. But we settled into our new place in a rented house, and our lives went on. On weekends, Amanda and I would go exploring the small towns in the counties surrounding Greenville. Amanda was always on the lookout for furniture and accessories that she could use in her business. I, on the other hand, was looking for antique radios. So far, I've bought 5 of them, with one of them being the exact model my mother used in the kitchen all those years ago. One of those day trips changed our lives forever. That day, we decided to visit the small town of Milton. After touring all the antique stores in one part of town and having lunch at a cute diner, we decided to explore a little more of the town. We turned down a side street off the main thoroughfare and ended up in a cute residential neighborhood. I wanted to turn back, but Amanda wished to continue wandering around the neighborhood. I reminded my wife that there were several other antique stores on the other side of town that we hadn't explored yet. Nevertheless, she was fascinated by the variety of houses in different styles. We were just rounding a corner when Amanda spotted a stately 2-story colonial about 2 blocks away. She insisted we take a look at it, and as we approached, Amanda was thrilled to see a for sale sign in the front yard. Not only was the house for sale, but it was open that day. Amanda practically dragged me up the steps, and the realtor was glad to have someone to show the house to. Apparently, it had not been a very good day. Anyway, Amanda followed the landlady, checking out every corner of the house. From what I could tell, the house was well built, but in need of repair. Having looked at the house once, Amanda wanted to walk through it again. However, I found something much more interesting to me. I discovered a radio station located in the field behind the house. While my wife looked around the second house, I wandered over to the station. The sign out front read, WJTW, 1590 AM, your native radio station. The letters I and O in the word radio were so faded they were almost invisible. I found Mrs. Sylvia Porter in an office inside the station. I must have startled her because she thought she had locked the door. I quickly learned that she owned both the house my wife had researched and the radio station. She and her husband ran the station for 32 years. At first, they lived in part of the radio station after Mr. Porter expanded the building. He added 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a small living room, and a kitchen to the original station building. He also installed a fireplace in the living room. After the birth of 2 girls, Mr. Porter built a 2-story colonial house across the field. Mrs. Porter said that 2 years ago her husband died, causing her eyes to cloud over. She tried to continue to run the station, but her heart was not in it. The station was put up for sale for over a year, but no one showed any interest in it. Finally, 5 months ago, Mrs. Porter closed the station. Besides, the station's license was up for renewal, and she had no intention of renewing it. Her plan was to simply sell the land. In talking with Mrs. Porter, I got the impression that she was desperate to move to Florida to be near her daughters. And so far, she was very discouraged because not only was no one making offers on the property, but the last 2 offers on the house had fallen through. None of the potential buyers could get financing. People then convinced Mrs. Porter not to pursue financing on her own. But now, she has begun to reconsider that decision. The more I talked to Mrs. Porter, the more encouraged I became. I wanted to own this radio station so badly that I could almost taste it. I told her I was very interested, but I didn't have enough money. Surprised by my interest, Mrs. Porter quickly offered me a mortgage on the property. When I met my wife again, my heart was beating at breakneck speed. Before I could say a word, Amanda informed me that she had fallen in love with the house and wanted to make an offer. She thought the house could be turned into a showcase for her business. Over a cup of coffee, I told her about the radio station and its availability. I offered to make an offer on both properties. When I first outlined my idea of buying the house and radio station, Amanda hesitated. She felt that we should use the 2 funds to put down the larger amount for the house and use the remainder to make the necessary repairs. Although the house was well built and sturdy, Mrs. Porter did little to maintain it. It needed to be painted inside and out, and the flooring replaced. In addition, cracks had appeared in some of the windows, and the porch decking needed repair. Some of the spindles on the railing were broken and needed to be repaired or replaced. I knew Amanda would freak out if I flatly rejected her idea. Instead, I explained that I was sure we could get a much better deal on the house if we bought both. I also told Amanda that I was confident that I could talk Mrs. Porter into financing the sale of the station and the house. By the end of our conversation, Amanda agreed. We offered $200,000 for the house, and after researching the value of the 10 acres on which the station was located, I concluded that they were worth $75,000. I then determined the depreciation value of the station equipment and offered $100,000 for it. Mrs. Porter accepted the offer and agreed to finance the sale of the house at 4% interest and the station at 7% interest. That same day, we signed the papers. 4 weeks later, we closed on the sale of the house and station. Amanda and I were over the moon. We put down $30,000 for the house, and I put down $20,000 for the station. The balance in the new house account was used to start the restoration, and I used the $8,000 remaining in the radio station account as operating funds. We moved into the new house 2 days after the deal closed. The drive to Greenville took about 45 minutes each way. I quickly learned to hate it, but restrained myself by saying that I now owned the radio station. Besides, the steady paycheck relieved the stress of dealing with both mortgages. Once we moved into the house, we immediately started renovating it. I contracted a painter to paint the inside of the house and then the outside. At the same time, Amanda contacted a flooring company. They convinced us to refinish the hardwood floors on the main floor, install carpeting on the stairs, and in the bedrooms. They also convinced us to lay tile in the kitchen and bathrooms. Amanda then arranged for a handyman to fix the windows and broken railings. As for the radio station, the first thing I did was contact Scott Wainwright. He was Mrs. Porter's contract engineer. I asked him to do a complete assessment of what the radio station needed in order of their importance. When Scott finished, it was a detailed report on every piece of equipment in the sound chain. It was all the equipment from the main studio, through the limiters and monitors to the transmitter. It also included everything that went out to the tower. A few small pieces of equipment, in his opinion, should have been replaced immediately. He was adamant, however, that I needed a new and improved automation program. Tom, Scott said, pointing to an automation system he recommended, with this system you can literally run the station all by yourself. That convinced me, and even though the automation system cost almost $4,000, I bought it. I then decided to program the station to hits from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, as well as country classics. I had no idea what listeners wanted, but figured it would work until I figured it out. As it turned out, it was exactly what the listeners wanted. Another thing that Scott shared caught my attention. Before he died, Fred had hired a broadcast engineer from Washington to do a feasibility study on moving the station tower 20 miles closer to Greenville. The study showed that such a relocation would provide a strong signal within the city limits of Greenville. I also learned that Fred had already filed an application for the new tower location with the FCC, and it had been approved. However, the application was set to expire in 3 months. I immediately applied for an extension, which was eventually granted. But the major stumbling block in this plan was cost. The total cost of building a new tower and ground system was to be about $125,000. And that was not counting the cost of the new land on which the tower would stand. That was money I didn't have. So I put the project on hold and just resumed the application, trying to raise the necessary funds. I took a week's vacation to help with home renovations and program the music into the new automation system. Once the music was loaded, I added station IDs and liner notes. Then I turned the station back on. Wonder of wonders, the response from residents throughout the neighborhood was overwhelmingly positive. And 2 days after the station was back on the air, my first advertiser walked through the doors. It was Herb Canner, owner of the local funeral home. I started working. For the next 18 months, only 2 things cast a shadow over my little slice of paradise. The first was that I still hated my job, especially the commute. The second shadow was that we found out that Amanda couldn't have children. I was devastated by this news, but surprisingly, Amanda was not upset, and she adamantly refused to consider adoption. This should have been my third red flag regarding Amanda. But of course, I missed it as well. Of the 2 problems, I could only solve one. The second, I had to learn to accept. So, one evening, I explained to Amanda that I wanted to quit my job in Greenville. She was very upset and scared when I first told her my intentions. Her interior design business was not growing the way she thought it would. In fact, Amanda was still only making about 80% of what she was making working for someone else. Amanda was adamant that I was fired, so I decided the best way to handle it was to show her the benefits in black and white. The next day at work, I got everything I needed to do done by mid-morning. I spent the rest of the day working on a spreadsheet to show Amanda how I could quit my job and our lifestyle wouldn't suffer. I was able to show that the money I was pouring into the station could cover all but about $1,000 a month of our expenses. And that, I was sure, would be more than offset because I would have more time to sell advertising. Still, that $1,000 would be enough to make Amanda back off. So I decided to offer one last option that I was ashamed I hadn't thought of sooner. I would advertise my wife's business for free on the radio station. Things were going her way that night, but Amanda really liked the idea of Amanda advertising her business for free on the radio station. And she especially liked the idea of voicing her own commercials. I really couldn't believe I hadn't offered Amanda the commercials sooner. I guess I was too busy finding new paying advertisers. My business plan was simple. I visited at least a dozen businesses each week. Some were existing advertisers, but most were not. I would introduce myself to the owner or manager and give them small promotional gifts, pens, notepads, or a calendar. Then I would tell them about the benefits of radio advertising and give them a list of our rates. The final tip was that I encouraged them to voice their own ads to make their business seem more personal. That way, new customers wouldn't come into their store as strangers. For the next 3 years, I lived my dream. I had a wife who I loved and who I thought loved me. I had realized my lifelong dream of owning a radio station and was doing well. But, as I said, my life had slid from the highest level into a pile of crap. It got to the point where I was on the verge of losing everything. Nevertheless, I didn't give up and slowly tried to work my way out. It was a battle I had to win for myself and everyone who depended on the station. One of those who desperately depended on the station was Lou Talbort. He worked the third shift at the Windward plant. Lou was a DJ in several major cities for 20 years until his alcohol addiction got to him. A month after the station went back on the air, I realized I needed more voices than just me, and sometimes Amanda. But I wasn't sure I could afford to pay anyone. But one day Lou walked in and introduced himself. At first I didn't know how to feel about him. Even though it was only 11 in the morning, I could smell alcohol. Nevertheless, I was intrigued when he started telling me about all the radio stations he worked for. I took a chance and hired him to host a show from 7 to 9 in the morning. When people found out I had hired Lou, they warned me I was making a mistake. But Lou was religious. Monday through Friday, he was on time. And one of the rules I made was no drinking before or during his show. At first, Lou cut back on drinking until the afternoon. Then he limited it to weekends only. Finally, he quit altogether. As Lou got soberer, I expanded his responsibilities and increased his paycheck. His morning show got off to an awkward start because it had been a long time since he'd worked on the air. And where Lou had worked before, someone else sat at the desk. But gradually, Lou got the hang of it, and listeners loved his show. His show was a mixture of music and stories. Lou told stories from his life and the history of the neighborhood. He also told stories about the unique people he met in the neighborhood and everywhere he lived. They were stories of struggle, sacrifice, tragedy, love, success, and redemption. I marveled at how he was constantly coming up with new and different stories to air. However, Lou could never master the smooth operation of the remote control and was constantly messing things up. Despite his constant mistakes, or maybe because of them, viewers loved Lou. The next person to find shelter at the station was a thin, pimply-faced young man with red hair who walked into the building one day. Apparently, he hadn't washed in a long time, for I could smell him from 15 feet away. I later learned that Jimmy's father had abandoned the family. His mother struggled with alcoholism while trying to raise 4 children. "What can I do for you, son?" I asked him. The boy looked panic-stricken. "I'm sorry, I'll leave." "Hey," I turned to him as he quickly turned to leave. "What's your name?" "Jimmy Saunders, sir," he said as he turned to face me. "Well, Jimmy Saunders, would you like a tour of the station?" "Really? That would be great," he asked incredulously, and then added, "If it wouldn't be too much trouble?" "No problem," I tried to reassure him. "There's nothing better than showing people your radio station. Although I don't really consider it my radio station. I consider it owned by the people of Calvary County." Jimmy reminded me of myself, only without the pimples and red hair. He was completely mesmerized by everything he saw. It amused me to watch Jimmy's face light up with wonder as we went from one room to another. I was watching a man who had just been bitten by the radio bug. And when the tour was over, I saw that Jimmy didn't want to leave, so I asked him if he wanted to volunteer at the station. Jimmy's face lit up like a Christmas tree, and he nodded vigorously. I took 2 t-shirts with the WJTW logo on them and held them out to Jimmy. He took them and clutched them tightly to his chest. It was clear from the look on his face that he appreciated the 2 t-shirts infinitely more than what I had paid for them. "There is one thing, though." I tried to figure out how to say what needed to be said without overwhelming the boy. "If you're going to work here, you'll need to shower before you come over." The look on Jimmy's face went from pure joy to utter panic. We don't have running water at our house. The pipe burst and Mom doesn't have the money to fix it. There's no more gym class at school, so I can't use the showers in the locker room." "That's not a problem, Jimmy," I said calmly. "Just bring some clean clothes tomorrow and you can shower here." That's how Jimmy started working for me. At first, he just cleaned the station, but then I started teaching him how to use the equipment in the production studio. He learned quickly, and soon he was shooting commercials. Then I started paying him. It was only $100 a week, but to Jimmy it was a fortune. He spent every penny buying food and clothes for his siblings. After 3 months, I gave him the evening shift on the air. He hosted a show that continued to feature our music, but covered events happening at the school. The show became quite popular, and with it, Jimmy's popularity at school began to grow. He was no longer the stinking outcast. I taught Jimmy how to set up equipment in soccer stadiums and even run the game or be the color commentator during soccer season. Finally, I hired Jimmy to host the afternoon show. That was 2 years ago, and now Jimmy was being considered for a DJ position in a much larger market. And it was Jimmy who gave me the solution to a potential crisis involving high school soccer games. The problem was that there were 5 high schools in the county, and each of them wanted a radio station to broadcast their Friday night games. I realized that if I broadcast one school's games to the detriment of the others, I risked alienating the fans of those teams. Jimmy came up with a unique solution. Since the schools play 10 games per season, he suggested broadcasting 2 games for each school. In addition, he suggested hiring students to attend the other 4 games. They will use digital voice recorders to record important moments from the other games. The next day, we would edit the recorders with footage from the game we broadcast and show it on the Saturday morning sports show. This scheme proved very popular and solved perhaps the biggest problem. About 2 years after I purchased the radio station, I found land that was ideal for the installation of a new tower. It was a 10-acre plot, as close as I could legally relocate under the application that Fred had originally filed. The 10-acre plot belonged to Edgar Brenner, one of the big farmers in the area. Edgar had a reputation as a ruthless businessman, and he proved it to me. He had 1,500 acres of prime farmland. In fact, he had 1,490 acres of prime land. The 10 acres I was interested in were quite swampy. In fact, only 1 acre of this tract was completely dry. In spite of this, Mr. Brenner told me he wanted $8,000 an acre. Those were the rates for prime farmland, and this tract was definitely not. Nevertheless, he wouldn't budge because he had thought it through and knew it was perfect for me. I only needed 5 acres, so I tried to get Edgar to sell me 5 acres on the road. But he said I had to buy all 10, or there would be no deal. I don't care at all whether I sell the land or not, he told me over the phone. I will, however, take out a 5-year mortgage at 9% interest. The prevailing rate at the bank was 3 to 4%. Mr. Brenner had discussed financing with local banks and knew they would not finance me. I looked everywhere for another piece of land, but nothing suitable came up. If I wanted the land, I would have to humble myself and accept Mr. Brenner's terms. I finally bought the land when I realized that the station could afford the mortgage even on Edgar's strict terms. About 6 months after I bought the land, business picked up and I needed a part-time bookkeeper to do the accounting and answer the phone and do the billing. I needed someone for 20 hours, and I wanted to pay about $200 a week. So I put out an ad saying that I was hiring. I even put a small ad in a Greenville newspaper that was being trashed. But I didn't get a single response. I was about to give up on the idea and wait until I could hire someone full-time. But one morning there was a knock on my door. When I looked up, I saw a young woman in her early 20s. Her facial expression reminded me of Jimmy's. She seemed scared to death. "I'm sorry to bother you," she apologized meekly, but there was no one there. "Is the job still available?" She held out a discarded newspaper to me. "Yes," I replied, studying it. She was small in stature, with light brown hair gathered into a ponytail. Her dress was wrinkled and her shoes were well worn. The young woman was slender, almost skinny. Still, she had a pretty face and a pleasant smile, albeit a little shy. The young woman continued to look around nervously until I pulled myself together. "Please have a seat," I said, pointing to the chair across from me. "I'm Tom Ambrose," I said, extending my hand across the table. "I'm Tracy Bronson," she replied, shaking my hand. "So, tell me about yourself," I inquired. "Do you have a resume?" "No, sir," she looked shocked. "I didn't realize I needed one." "No problem," I assured her with a wave of my hand. "Do you have any bookkeeping experience?" She shook her head and looked down at the floor. Truth be told, keeping my books didn't require any bookkeeping experience. We recorded everything on a computer spreadsheet. "Are you familiar with Windows?" She looked up and nodded with a tiny smile. "I know how to use a word processor." "What about spreadsheets?" When she shook her head, "No." I sensed that this job wasn't for her. But what happened next made me look at the interview in a completely different way. "Mommy?" I heard the quiet call of a small child. Tracy instantly rose from her seat. "I'm terribly sorry. That's my daughter. I'll put her back in the car." "No, take her inside," I said with a smile. "I don't mind." The girl was no more than 3 or 4 years old. Her thin blonde hair was newly brushed and had a pink bow on it. In each corner of the girl's mouth were the remnants of a lollipop. She held her mother's hand and sucked her thumb. When Tracy sat down again, the little girl climbed into her mother's lap and rested her head on her shoulder. "Can we eat soon?" the little girl asked. "I'm really hungry." "Hush, sweetheart. We'll go eat when I'm done. This is my daughter, Kimberly." Tracy kissed her daughter's head. I reached into my cupboard and grabbed a Tupperware container. I opened it and asked the girl, "Do you like cookies?" Kimberly's eyes lit up, but she looked questioningly at her mother. Cassie nodded, and Kimberly took one of the cookies. "Thank you." "One cookie isn't enough," I said with a smirk, taking 2 cookies out of the container and placing them on the table in front of Kimberly. "You need at least 2 more. How about you, Mom? These are homemade chocolate chip cookies that Mrs. Myers from down the street baked this morning. She brings them to us every week, saying she's bribing us to keep putting the same music on WJTW. Mrs. Myers will be very upset if you don't try at least a couple." Kimberly devoured her cookie, and Tracy took a bite out of one of her own. Tracy kept her eyes on me, probably trying to figure out if I was going to give her the job or not. I took another look at Kimberly sitting on her lap and decided to give her a chance. "Well, if you're interested in the job, it's yours," I said as I stood up. I watched Tracy's eyes light up as she thanked me for the opportunity. "Now, I'll get the W-9 form and we can get you processed." As I was about to head back to my office door, I heard Kimberly ask her mother a question that damn near broke my heart. "Mommy, are we going to have to sleep in the car again tonight? It's so cold in there." "It won't be for long, honey," Tracy replied sadly. I waited a few seconds and then went back to my office. "If you're going to work here, you should at least know where the bathroom is. Come on, I'll give you a tour of the station." I led them through the radio part of the building. What struck me most was Kimberly's wide-eyed surprise when she realized that what was playing in the main studio was being aired. I saved the residential part of the tour for last. The previous owners used this part of the building as their home. They raised their children here until they could afford to build that colonial house across the street. My wife and I bought the house and the lot at the same time. I walked them through the rooms on the living side and then made an offer. I hoped Tracy wouldn't be intimidated by this. "Oh, hey, it just occurred to me that you're new in town and probably haven't had time to find a place yet," I said uncertainly. "If you've already found a place or plan on staying at one of the motels, that's fine. But if you want, you can use this part of the station until you find something of your own." I could see that Tracy wasn't entirely happy with my offer, so I tried to reassure her. "Look, I know it sounds a little weird, but my daytime boyfriend Jimmy has spent a lot of nights here. Even my morning guy Lou slept here when his apartment was being fumigated. Anyway, I was planning on putting new locks on the bedroom door, but I didn't get around to it. If you want, I'll install one in the big bedroom and you'll just have the keys. But I don't mind if you want to." It was clear that Kimberly wanted her mother to take her up on the offer, but Tracy still wasn't sure. Even though I knew they were desperate for a place to live, I wasn't going to push for it. It would have to be her decision. "If you want, I'll put the locks on right now," I said, glancing at my watch. "But if you're not interested, I have to go. You can start tomorrow morning at 9. Tracy looked at her daughter and then at me. "I would really appreciate it if we could stay here. You were right, we don't have a place to stay yet." It took me about 15 minutes to put a new lock on the bedroom, and then I handed Tracy the keys. I pointed to the refrigerator in the kitchen. "I think there's leftover pizza and cans of soda in there. Help yourself to whatever's in there. Those are the rules here on the station. If you can find it, you can eat it or drink it. Oh, and don't forget the cookies in my office. Please finish them so I don't eat them again." So Tracy began working and living at the station. For the first week, Tracy kept pretending that she would soon find a place to live. But I knew Tracy couldn't rent a closet for the money I was paying her. Finally, at the beginning of the second week, she admitted that she had nowhere to go. Tracy told me that she left her abusive boyfriend when he started hitting Kimberly. I gave her permission to stay here as long as she wanted. Hiring Tracy was one of the best decisions I ever made. She mastered the spreadsheet program in less than an hour. Tracy then reorganized the filing system so we could actually find something. She created a billing schedule for our clients and a template for our invoices. I only hired her for 20 hours, but Tracy worked at least 40 every week and never complained. After the third week, I felt guilty, so I raised her pay to $250 a week. I then told her that if she wanted to try her hand at sales, I would pay her 25% of any advertising dollars she brought into the station. Tracy took to sales like a duck to water. Soon she was making $400 or $500 a month in commissions. I loved having both Tracy and Kimberly by my side. Tracy was willing to take on any job I gave her, and I never knew where I would catch Kimberly playing. However, she was not allowed to enter the transmitting room, which I kept under lock and key. She could play in the studios if no one was working there. Amanda took offense to me when I told her that I let them live in the living area of the station. Even when I explained that they lived in their car, Amanda didn't care. She was concerned about what people would think about a young woman living there, and even with her daughter. That should have been another red flag for me, but I missed it too. Still, I thought Amanda and I were living like a dream. I felt like we were closer than ever, and I didn't think I could love anyone more. Also, Amanda's business had grown so much that she was now earning more than she had at her previous job. The commercials on the channel helped a lot. Everything was going so well. Even our neighbors were warm and friendly. As I mentioned, Mrs. Myers baked cookies and pies for us. The neighborhood kids played stickball, street hockey, and dodgeball on the road in front of the station. Sometimes when I wasn't busy, I would go out and join them. But because I was much bigger, I had to use my left hand for all the activities because I was naturally right-handed. When we played hockey, I was only allowed to be the goalie, and my goal was twice as big. My favorite neighbor was Henry Wilson, who lived right across the street from the station. He was a retired Marine who had fought in Vietnam. He came to the station 3 or 4 times a week to have coffee with me and chat about this and that. He had some great stories, and not all of them were war-related. And yes, some of them were of the X variety. Henry lost his wife, Ellie, 5 years ago, and I could tell he was still grieving for her. When he talked about Ellie, you could see the love in his eyes. I really enjoyed hanging out with Henry, but I could see that as the years went by, he began to decline. He had cancer, probably from Agent Orange, and a bad heart. 10 years ago, he had open heart surgery and has had 5 stents put in since then. Still, Henry never complained, even though he was sick most of the time and money was always tight. He lived on Social Security and a military pension. But medical bills that weren't covered by insurance were leaving him broke. I suggested he go to a hospital for combat veterans, but he said he would rather die than go to that rat-infested place. I was forced to agree that our local combat veterans hospital was one of the oldest. Therefore, it was chronically understaffed and poorly maintained. In my opinion, it is just criminal how poorly we treat so many veterans. People always say the only 2 things you can count on are death and taxes, but they are wrong. The only 2 things you can really count on are death and change. That's exactly what happened to my perfect little slice of paradise. Things started to change. The economy started to crumble with the closing of the Windward factory. Then Walmart left, followed by one of the big drugstores. But the neighborhood had known hard times before, and residents struggled to adjust. Then the economy across the country took a sharp downturn. Everyone's business was affected, and the radio station was not left behind. Advertising revenue dropped another 20%, and I struggled to compensate. To some extent, I softened the blow by bartering with businesses. For example, I opened an account at a local gas station. I got gasoline for our cars for the commercials on the radio. I made a deal with the gym that Amanda and I frequented. And things seemed to stabilize for a while, but the financial blows weren't over yet. Braxton Machine Company announced that it was moving its manufacturing to Mexico. Braxton machined parts for commercial and military airplanes. The company employed 400 people. The loss of Braxton sent shockwaves through our community, especially when some of the smaller businesses began to go bankrupt. The local Chamber of Commerce decided to try to attract new businesses to the area. If they couldn't replace the lost jobs, the situation could get very bad for the local economy and the people who live here. I was elected to a committee to look for new businesses and hopefully attract them to Milton or the surrounding area. I was just starting to work on this when a snake crawled into my little paradise. The snake's name was Chad Duncan III. Chad's family owned 112 small and medium-sized newspapers. The small newspapers were mostly the ones that were thrown on the lawn for free. They also owned 12 regional magazines and 4 television stations. 2 were CBS affiliates, and 2 were NBC affiliates. The family's business plan was simple. Whether it was a newspaper, magazine, or television station, they kept it only if it was profitable. None of the organizations individually brought in much money, but together they brought the family an impressive cash flow. One day Amanda came home later than usual, talking animatedly about a new client, Chad Duncan III. He had hired her to design the office of their new newspaper, the Milton Free Press. I was uneasy about Chad showing up after all these years, but I wasn't too worried. It was another red flag I'd missed. The chamber had welcomed Chad with open arms, seeing his opening a new business in town as a good omen. It was a joke. He hired only 3 people, a reporter, a salesman, and an office manager who could do double duty as reporter or salesman. But everything else the new paper used was taken from somewhere else. All the materials were brought in from elsewhere, and the paper itself was printed in Greenville. I had the opportunity to talk to Chad several times at chamber meetings and other community events. He seemed pleasant enough, and I mistakenly believed that our college disagreements were behind us. He seemed comfortable in our community, made several generous donations to local charities, and joined several local special interest clubs. Chad came south to expand his family's media business in the southeast. Before Chad ran into Amanda, his family had already purchased the Greenville Times newspaper. He was going to start 8 other small-town newspapers and launch a fishing and hunting magazine. 4 of those small newspapers were to be located in towns in this county. But Chad seemed more interested in helping my wife build her business than he was in building his family's business. Soon, Amanda started coming home later and later. Then she started staying overnight in Greenville to attend morning meetings. It was a whole bunch of warning signs that I finally didn't miss. I could feel Amanda drifting away from me. But I didn't want to give up without a fight. I sent my wife flowers, bought her small intimate gifts, and tried to take her on romantic dates. Nothing worked, and that's when I put a tracker on Amanda's phone. I found out that Amanda was spending her sleepovers with Chad. The war was over, and I had lost. I seriously considered going to Greenville and beating the crap out of Chad. But that would have resulted in me going to jail, and Chad could smirk at me through the bars. And so, on top of all my economic turmoil, my wife of 8 years betrayed me. Amanda had gone back to her first love from college. That Amanda was going to leave me was bad enough, but that she left me for a man I despised was a whole other level of pain. And if I let myself think about it for too long, I would start hyperventilating. In the end, I decided I had to talk to Amanda. I wasn't going to be like my Uncle Fred. His wife had divorced him to marry her boss. He made a fool of himself by begging and pleading with his wife to go back to him for months. Eventually, Uncle Fred had a nervous breakdown and had to be hospitalized. It was sad and embarrassing to watch. And I swore I would never be like my uncle. So I decided the best way to handle the situation was to tell Amanda it was over. But she beat me to it. I got home one evening and saw Chad and Amanda sitting in the living room. Amanda looked nervous, and Chad was sitting there with a smirk on his face. "Tom, we need to talk," Amanda said, smiling at Chad. However, as the British say, they had to put themselves to the test that night. Still, the whole mess finally fell into place in my mind. Chad had promised to pay me back for my college newspaper prank, and it looked like he'd done just that. Stolen my wife from me. 2 things got me through the divorce. The first was the tone I set when my wife announced she was divorcing me. It took everything I had, but I just nodded and said, "Okay." I could see that my lack of emotion made Amanda a little nervous, and Chad was clearly annoyed that I hadn't turned into an emotional wreck. It convinced me that pretending the divorce wasn't a big deal was the right thing to do. How I would play with the divorce was another matter. I knew Amanda wanted our house, and she knew I wanted the radio station. In Amanda's mind, it was fair to get the house and half the radio station. Even in this negotiation, I showed no emotion. I told Amanda that she could have half of the radio station. Since she was losing money, she would be responsible for half of the station's debts. This cooled her ardor, as she did not want any part of the radio station. After much negotiation, Amanda agreed to have the house and radio station appraised. If the radio station was worth more than the house, I would pay Amanda half of the difference. On the other hand, if the house was worth more, Amanda would have to pay me half of that value. We had 2 appraisals done on each property, and they showed that the house was worth $20,000 to $40,000 more than the station. When this came out, Amanda wailed that she would not pay me $10,000 if we used the lower appraised value. Amanda's attitude about paying me for a different value really annoyed me, but I didn't show it. Instead, I had my attorney inquire about how Amanda would pay me child support. At the time, she was making more money from her business than I was from the radio station. Thanks mostly to Chad. Chad's idea of seducing my wife by getting involved in her business made itself felt again. When my lawyer brought it up, Amanda had another attack. The divorce stalled until I suggested a private meeting. While things were moving along, I still had to keep the station afloat financially. During this time, I also spent an unhealthy amount of time thinking of ways to get revenge on the two cheaters. However, most of my ideas were stupid or would have landed me in jail. Eventually, I came up with two ideas that I thought would hurt them both at least a little bit. The first thing I did was to take all of Amanda's commercials off the air. Then I went to Maggie's Interior Design, a small interior design company 2 towns away. I made the price ridiculously low so Maggie couldn't refuse. As soon as Amanda realized that her ad had been replaced by a competitor's, she called me. She demanded an explanation as to why her commercial wasn't being spun. "You've got to be kidding, Amanda," I said incredulously. "We're getting a divorce. You didn't think I was going to keep spinning your commercials for free." That was only my first shot, though. When Amanda wanted to buy time, I told her I had no spots available. My soon-to-be ex-wife went ballistic. I just hung up the phone with a smile. The next thing I did was attack Chad's business. If I had been in my right mind, I doubt I would have done what I did. I went to every advertiser in Chad's newspapers and tried to sell them the idea of splitting their advertising budget. The idea was that companies would buy small ads in the newspapers and use the remainder for radio spots. People would hear about their business on the air, and we would pay attention to the newspaper ads. To my great surprise, my plan actually worked. We convinced about 40% of Chad's advertisers to take the deal. The extra revenue helped the station a little bit, but we kept going around in circles. Needless to say, Chad was furious, which made me very happy. The divorce was still dragging on, but Chad and Amanda were driving around town like a married couple. This annoyed me, so I asked my lawyer to tell Amanda's lawyer that we would just go to court if we couldn't agree in advance. Eventually, they agreed to meet at her attorney's office. I agreed, although this did not make my attorney happy. When my lawyer and I walked into the conference room, Chad was sitting there smirking. I smiled and nodded at him. "Chad, you're going to have to leave." "I'm not leaving," Chad growled, and Amanda nodded. "Well then, I guess the meeting is over," I said, turning to the lawyer. "We'll just let the court deal with it." "Please hold on a second," Amanda's attorney addressed us as we were leaving. "Give me a few minutes to discuss this with my client." Moments later, we were invited back in and Chad left, out of breath. "Okay, before we start, Amanda," I said, looking directly at my wife, "I don't know what I've done to be treated as badly as you've treated me. If you wanted out of our marriage, you didn't need to cheat behind my back. All you had to do was tell me you wanted a divorce. I would have given it to you. I expected more, and I can't tell you how disappointed I am in you." Amanda blushed, but made no apology. Truth be told, I wasn't going to hold my breath either. That's when my lawyer stepped in. "Mrs. Ambrose, I have your income for the last 2 years and Tom's income for the same period. As you can see, you earned about $30,000 more per year than Tom. I think the court would approve alimony of $300 to $500 a month." "That's pure nonsense," Amanda snapped back. "Tom, if this is your attempt to hurt me, I'll fight you." I only smiled sadly and said calmly, "Look, Amanda, I don't want your alimony, but you won't even pay me half of the difference between the two properties. I'm sure your attorney will tell you that the court will definitely make you pay at least $10,000 and probably take the average of the two appraisals, which would be $15,000. And there's a chance that the court will take the higher of the two assessments, which would be $20,000. In addition, they might add alimony. So why don't we compromise? Pay me $15,000 and I'll waive alimony." Amanda stared at me for a few long moments. Then the anger seemed to drain out of her, and I saw cold logic settle into her eyes. It was clear that all the love she had once felt for me was gone. After a long pause, Amanda agreed to the compromise. "Then I guess we're done," I said, trying to sound cheerful. Before I left the conference room, I walked over to Amanda to mess with her some more. I kissed the top of her head and lied to her. I hope you and Chad will be very happy. I stopped in the doorway and turned around to wave to Amanda. The uncertainty and confusion on her face was now readable. It was a small thing, but it felt good. The second thing that got me through the divorce, and probably the most important, was Tracy and Kimberly. They were rays of sunshine in a sea of pain and suffering. I always maintained a completely professional relationship with Tracy. Still, it was nice to have someone completely on my side. Tracy was shocked when she found out what Amanda had done. Nevertheless, the divorce was forcing me to change a lot of things. When I had to leave the house we shared with Amanda, Tracy asked if she should look for an apartment. No, don't spend the money on an apartment. We can share the living quarters, I insisted, and then tried to add some humor. I'm not worried. I'll put a lock on my bedroom so you can't take advantage of me. Tracy blushed brightly at my remark, and then I felt uneasy. I'm just kidding. We'll just be roommates, unless you'd be more comfortable having your own apartment. No, Tracy immediately objected. Kimberly and I love living here. We'd love it if you lived here permanently. I was happy they were staying because I wouldn't have been able to handle the loneliness on top of everything else. Having Tracy and Kimberly around helped me heal my soul as the weeks turned into months. We started out as employer and employee, but quickly became friends. Then we became very good friends. About 2 months after my divorce, I worked up the courage to ask Tracy out on a date. End of part 1. Part 2 may be coming out in 10 hours. Write in the comments if you're waiting for it. Also, give a like under this video and subscribe to my channel. I hope you enjoyed this video.